Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. We are looking at Carrion today. This is a new indie horror game that comes to us from Devolver Digital, and it is available on Nintendo Switch, PC and Xbox One. For some reason it is not on PlayStation 4 at the moment as far as I'm aware, but I am sure at some stage it will also make its way to the PS4. So it's a game that pretty much everybody can get their hands on. As you can see, it is a very indie game. It has that 2D pixelated spirit going for it. But one of the things you'll notice very quickly about playing this game is it really goes all in with the horror, and it's very visceral. So I actually really like this game. I have a full review going up on digitallydownloaded.net that you'll be able to check out as well. But the long and short of it is this game's visceral intensity to its violence, as well as its atmosphere, really does help carry it through a game that I just probably wouldn't normally play otherwise. I'm not a huge fan of these kinds of exploration 2D Metroidvania style games, but this one really did hook me in thanks to its very strong creative vision and just how visceral it is. So do check out my review because that'll go into a lot more depth about that. What I wanted to do with this video though was talk about how the game is kind of presented, because there was a marketing term that the Devolver Digital people used which really fascinated me. In the whole lead up to the release of the game, it has been billed as a reverse horror game. And the reason it is a reverse horror game is because you play as the monster. And I think that's really interesting and actually does tell us quite a bit about how the games industry as a whole looks at horror as a genre. So I've done a lot of study of horror in my time. It was one of my main focuses when I was at university doing film and literature. It's a big passion of mine. I do love pretty much everything to do with horror, and I find it very fascinating from a psychological point of view as well as a philosophical point of view. So yeah, how the video game industry has presented horror over the years has been something that I've found really interesting, and this game is a really interesting case study in that. So that's what this video is about. For the full review, check out my written review. This is not really an analysis of the game as a game, it's more a discussion around a topic that the game kind of brings up. So one of the things that has always interested me about the way that the video game industry approaches horror is that it seems to work on the premise that horror is when the protagonist is attacked by something grotesque. And that's a very general way of looking at it, but if you look at pretty much every horror game, whether it be the Resident Evil kind of shoot 'em up horrors, the Lovecraftian style horror, which is very common these days, you look at the stalker horrors, which were particularly popular a couple of generations ago, the likes of Haunting Ground and Clock Tower and that kind of thing. The common thread between them all was that whether you could fight back or not, you were playing as a hero type character. Now they might be a flawed hero, as in the case of the likes of Silent Hill and some of the Eternal Darkness protagonists and whatever. They might be a flawed hero, but they are still a hero type character, and they are beset upon by some kind of monster or monsters, and the goal is to survive. The horror then comes from those monsters being powerful, jumping out at you from behind or through windows or whatever, kind of the jump scare thing, or just generally the horror comes from facing down that monster or trying to avoid running into it, in the case of stalker horror where you can't fight back. But that seems to be where the industry, or how the industry interprets the nature of horror. So when you get to a game like Carrion here, which is billing itself as reverse horror, it makes sense based on that definition, because really in this case you are playing the monster, therefore the protagonists are the kind of the humans, or they're not the protagonists, sorry, the hero types, which are the humans. They're the ones being attacked by you as the player. So I can see where the tagline of it being a reverse horror game comes from. But if you look at, I guess, horror in other genres, in other mediums, if you look at horror in film, for example, if you look at horror in literature especially, and theatre and whatever, the nature of horror is a little bit different. And I've always felt this about the video game industry. I love horror games. I love them a great deal, actually. But at the same time, I've always felt that they have a fundamentally different view and understanding of what horror is compared to the other mediums. And I think that this discussion here, right here, is it's one of the main core reasons that horror is treated differently in video games. So you look at horror and the way it's treated in other mediums, and in a lot of cases, yes, of course, there are examples where the horror comes from the monster attacking the humans, such as Friday the 13th with Jason Voorhees, Aliens, Predator, Freddy Krueger. There's plenty of examples, especially in the slasher horror subgenre, of exactly the same approach to horror as we see in most video games, or almost all video games. But there's also a lot of horror that is treated differently, and it's something that I've always waited to see video games do perhaps a little bit more frequently, or perhaps better, but there aren't too many examples of it. So in a lot of literature and film, the horror is the situation, with the monster really being secondary to that, if there is a monster at all. And a lot of the time it comes from the perspective of the monsters rather than the characters. So a good example of that is Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. No one would say that Interview with a Vampire is not horror, but it's certainly not anti-horror. But that book, and film as well, the story comes from the perspective of the vampires, and the horror is not so much what they do, although it is certainly grotesque in a way, but it's more about the society and how they're built into society, how society affects them, and it's really more a discussion about the nasty side of society. And another good example of that is It, the book, not so much the films. The films put a pretty heavy emphasis on Pennywise, which is not quite there in the book. The book is more a coming-of-age story, and the horror that kind of comes from coming-of-age, and Pennywise is really kind of incidental to that, or if anything, he's kind of metaphoric for kind of key moments in the coming-of-age process. And the horror, again, it's a social thing, it's a social commentary. And another good example is Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is quite an old book now, but it was also a reflection on society, and in that case it was a criticism of the church and some of the hypocrisies that Matthew Lewis saw in religion. And it featured demons and monsters and all that kind of stuff, and it was told from a couple of different perspectives, but most particularly the perspective of a very anti-hero kind of human monster as such that doesn't deal with the devil. And but again, it's not about the monster itself that makes it horror. It's about the social commentary that's kind of wrapped around what the events are being depicted. Dracula is another really great example. Everybody thinks Dracula is this great monster book, and it is certainly the monster is a big part of it. But again, it was a reflection, I guess, on Puritan attitudes towards sexuality that Bram Stoker saw in society, and there's plenty of other arguments to suggest it was also some of his homosexual tendencies that he was kind of repressing, if you look into the history and the biography of the author. But again, it was largely a reflection on society, and the horror came from that, with the monster really being kind of emblematic of it rather than the cause of it. So all of that together means that it's quite odd for me to see a game like Carrion here be described as anti-horror, because it's horror, it's just plain horror. And it doesn't really make a social commentary or anything, but as somebody who has seen a lot of films and read a lot of books that are horror-tuned, to the idea that playing as the monster is an anti-horror experience, it's just a little odd to me. It's no comment, again, on the quality of the game. I think it's great, and please do read my review, but it's just an odd way of describing this game. Anyway, hopefully that was a bit of food for thought. If you like horror, please do chat with me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. That way I'll have the subscribers. I'll be able to do a lot more. And please do back me on Patreon if you do enjoy my videos. Thank you as always for watching, and we will see you at the next video.